this is the second lecture of 7. It's called Deep Time, so it's about history. And what we have seen last time is this completely urbanized planet with these urban downtowns and the peripheral cities on this planet. And we have seen what's behind it. Super exponential growth of the human population over the last 10,000 years, culminating in our lifetimes. We have seen that this dynamic has reasons. We looked at systems engineering, we looked at complex systems science, and we looked at systems ecology to explain what's happening. We understood that this dynamic is somewhere in between the waxing and waning of the ice ages and a runaway nuclear meltdown. So it's a dynamic which is there, but for us humans, not so easily visible, because in our lifetimes things change, but they not often change radically. So we tend to look at our environments as fundamentally stable, or at least progressing in one direction. We saw in systems ecology that there are also moments of radical change, of disruptions, and we understood that mathematically as the expression of a singularity created by the super exponential growth which we are currently witnessing. We then tried to understand this complexity in space, in the now, by looking at history, by going back in time. We looked at the 10 biggest cities in each age, from today to the 1950s, the 1900s, the 1800s, the 1500s, now we are in the Middle Ages. We looked at 1000 after Christ, 100 after Christ, so the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. We looked at the time before Christ, and then we realized that in the end, urbanity has an origin from where it all emerged. And then going even further back in time, we found this place, Göbekli Tepe, in the Fertile Crescent, southern Anatolia in today's Turkey, where we argued that urbanity was somehow invented. We saw that this place was a moment when people came together to build spaces of rituals, spaces which generated the first settlements and led to the domestication both of weeds and of animals. It also generated not only the infrastructures, but also the institutions which allowed us to have our urban life in the form of the first stories, which were stories of continuity of humankind and a discussion of the origins of humankind. And I argued that with these first moments of urbanization, we put together this system of infrastructures and institutions, spaces and stories, which allows us to socially differentiate, to share work, and to be generating a surplus, which allows us to grow these types of urban systems over time. And we saw that from this first moment of urbanization, with the technologies and the stories of that time, with then more powerful technologies and new stories, bigger societies developed. And then in a final step, today, of course, again with new technologies and new stories, even larger systems had been created. What we will talk about in the next lecture is that each of these technological systems brought with it also its own proclivities to particular societies, its own frame of mind, so to speak. Talking with Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. So also here, the technologies shape societies. And we will see in the next lectures what that means or could mean. For now, we take these urban axioms as our core understanding of what urbanity does. We saw last time that in cities we transact on the right, meaning we exchange things, we consume things, we orchestrate resource flows, the flow of things. We, on the left-hand side, however, also interact like we do now. We exchange information. This exchange of information allows us to socially differentiate and in the end to generate a differentiated, diverse culture. Both of these moments of exchange allow us to have relations. And again, these relations, of course, we try to stabilize in space and time with spaces and narratives, with infrastructures and institutions. And the better we can do that, the bigger our civilization, so to speak, can be. And we also saw that in order for these relations to function, we need, on the one hand, good technologies. On the other hand, we also need trust. Trust means we believe collectively in the permanence of relationships. As soon as we do that, we can activate that trust as capital, or speaking with Bourdieu, as social capital, as cultural capital, industrial capital, or, as I said last time, as financial capital. All of these three things together give us the connectedness, almost like a crystal on the one hand, where all molecules are connected together, or almost like an ecology where all flows are connected together, which allows us to live the differentiated, fairly secure, collective life which we are enjoying. Importantly, on the side of transaction, things are caught in the gravity well of the planet, so we have to deal with mass, friction, and inertia. So their connectedness can only go so far, but we achieved great things thanks to industrialization, which was basically an effort to speed up the manipulation and transport of matter. But in order to have even more connectedness, we also learned from the very beginning of urbanity to virtualize things. Virtualization, of course, we will see this in the fourth lecture, very much based on the gift of language, so on our ability to actually communicate in an extremely efficient, almost non-matter-based way. And the final peak currently of virtualization is, of course, digitalization, a language which is so powerful that it can connect everything with everything, and of course allowed us to achieve a form of connectedness which today spans in a very liquid way the entire globe, bringing about what we call globalization. This is where we are at today, and the question is how it will continue. We saw that at the core of the urban is also the ability to protect this exchange, as I said, for example, with city walls. The city then also protects resource flows and generates services and goods which are exported, and with that draws resources and people also into the city simply because it's attractive. It's the place where things are happening. And we saw with the concept of import replacement by Jane Jacobs how one of these core cities in the trade routes and resource flows it tends to generate also incentivizes, so to speak, the creation of peripheral cities and towns, which are small in the beginning, add a bit of value, but over time become more and more capable of being cities themselves. They learn how to become and be a city. And when then the core city disappears, for whatever reason, these peripheral cities can take over. So import replacement on the one hand means that a peripheral city starts to produce goods and services which it originally imported from the core city itself. But at the same time, it's a kind of reaching maturity and becoming sufficiently independent that it's not a problem when the core city disappears. Now, if you now imagine this mechanism playing itself out on the face of the planet, then this will generate the kind of urban relay run which we saw last time, where the idea of a city started in Göbekli Tepe as a very simple concept with simple infrastructures and institutions, became a real city, however still very easy to understand with the Mesopotamian cities and the polycentric urban system they were a part of, and from there then started to spread the world. And this relay run we want to look at today in a bit more detail. I base these ideas very much on the work of Jane Jacobs. Important for you to read, for example, could be The Economy of Cities, because in there she explains the concept of urbanity actually quite well, arguing that cities are the core of economies, not as Adam Smith was arguing, nations, right? So cities are the driver, which makes sense because in cities is where we are condensing people, value chains, and narratives in a way that allows us to generate surplus. I'm also very much referring to the work of Fernand Braudel, the founder of the Annales and the thinker of the longue durée, so the idea that we need to understand social developments with a long-term perspective. And also Sir Peter Hall's Syrian Civilization is extremely helpful. On the other hand, for me an eye-opener was this work by Xingzi Chu on world ecological degradation and the recurring dark ages, conceptualizing not only the blossoming but also the collapse of city systems. He argues that cities boom and bust, and when they bust, the historic record disappears and the archaeological record becomes scant, almost invisible. At the same time, the pollen count of tree pollen in the record actually increases. So he argues that culture and nature are in a kind of a seesaw system where when culture expands, nature retreats, and when culture collapses, then nature comes back. And he shows very nicely how this is happening. And with Dark Age, of course, he simply denominates a moment in history from where we have little historical record, little writing, few big buildings, and most importantly, no cultural complexity. And then finally, this I showed last time already, Jared Diamond, from a biological and anthropological point of view, is interesting because he showed how societies thrive or collapse. A famous example of his is the Easter Island Society, which, of course, in this limited system boundaries of the Easter Island, boomed and then completely disappeared. While on the other hand, he shows that on the island of Dictopia, a Polynesian island, there a society was able to exist for millennia in a kind of a permacultural kind of way. Societies do not have to collapse. We can also choose to go the way of permaculture. And the big conundrum, of course, we need to solve what role cities play in this decision. Because as we have seen, cities inherently are dynamic organisms if we don't manage and constrain them in some way. So this is the start, Göbekli Tepe, and here we now dive in a bit deeper in our move, in our journey through the centuries, trying to understand how this idea of the city emerged and how it transformed and became what we see today. And in these summary pages, you always find our 3 urban axioms, so interactions, transactions, and relations. Again, all 3 are important. And of course, they're super simplified, right? Each of these individual chapters, some of which are very short, is an entire discipline in a university. But nevertheless, it gives you an idea of the dynamics. So what we need to keep in mind together is not exactly the detail of each of these stations, but much rather the general direction and the general mechanisms and systematic relationships. Now, Göbekli Tepe, we talked about this already, in the middle, was a place to feast. It was a moment when beer was invented because we had wheat and grass, or grass at the time, which was fermented and therefore alcohol created. That very likely generated the domestication of wheat, which I will explain in a second. It was also a pilgrimage site on the left, which attracted people from up to 160 kilometers around that site, maybe even much more, but we simply cannot prove that. And the argument of the archaeologist Schmidt was that the idea of the city did not start as a city, but it started as a temple. It started as a coming together for a reason, trying to understand the past and trying to understand and envision the future. And in order to stabilize this collective vision, people spent a lot of time and effort to produce this relationship machine with these big stone structures with 10 to 20 ton pillars, and you have to imagine how difficult it was to move these things. And what is now interesting, that in the later Sumerian cities, 5,000 years later, they told these stories of agriculture, animal husbandry, and weaving being brought to mankind from the sacred mountain Ekur, which was inhabited by Anuna deities, very, very ancient gods without individual names. So it is as if the Sumerians in their cities, Uruk and Ur and others, which we will see later, are remembering a time when these first hunter and gatherers who settled started to produce the tools and narratives for the civilizations we enjoy now. This is how this relationship machine looked like. I mean, you know, you could think about a church, you can think about a temple, you can think about a meeting room, you can think about a disco, you can think about, you know, all sorts of places where we congregate in a built manner, in an architectural manner, and these were some of the first ones. You see a bit how we can imagine that this system worked. Already here, of course, the attempt of ritualizing access to the center to make it interesting and powerful, to not only have a story which gives us hope for the future, but turn this story into a built symbol which is powerful and strong and impressive enough that we really believe in this narrative which gives us a vision and hope for the future. Right? This is like a pact which they had together in order to ensure that all of these people were thinking the same thing, were believing in the same story, had the same images in their minds. And with these same images in their minds, you could activate this group of people and make them things they normally wouldn't do. For example, survive together. And in our fourth lecture, when we talk about deep cognition, we will look more at this resonance between narrative, build structure, and our individual as well as collective minds. This is Klaus Schmidt, who was instrumental in kind of digging out this site. I already told you last time that it was the origin of domesticated wheat here in the Fertile Crescent. So all of the wheats which we have today go back to species which you can still find in the wild here, right? So literally, we took these things here as a biological finding and turned them into what today is an industrialized agricultural system. But it all goes back to this moment 10,000 years ago, where the wild einkorn, which you see on the left, which was still brittle, where the seeds were falling out very easily, was domesticated by several hundreds of years of hands grabbing this einkorn, selecting inadvertently those less brittle rachis, turning them into what we know today as wheat. And again, here I already told you that knowledge then and those stories and those technologies were then taken, people moving down to the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, so Mesopotamia. In Greek this means between the rivers, where people then started these bigger city systems, and these city systems then again led to the birth of people like Abraham. Abraham then moved to the Levante, so the Mediterranean Sea, today's Israel, and started the Judeo-Christian tradition, but bringing with him some of these very, very old stories, specifically, of course, the story also of Adam and Eve, the loss of paradise, and with Cain, the origin of agriculture. And this is a little depiction of Sumerians drinking beer. This is probably what you have to imagine what that looked like. You know, so these two people on the top, they have straws, like literally straws, you know, wheat straws, and are drinking together out of this pot in which beer is fermented. And it's interesting that beer is almost like the grease, you know, like the a lubrication which allowed people to share stories more easily and to believe maybe in these narratives of hope more readily than without alcohol. You know, alcohol basically was breaking down certain distances for individuals to come closer together, maybe in a way, therefore also allowing the density of people we now have in urbanity to function. However, in between Göbekli Tepe and Uruk and Ur, there were several millennia also of more farm-based settlements. Of course, Göbekli Tepe people did not immediately be able to go down there to Uruk and Ur and immediately start the cities. There were kind of stations in between. Now this station, Çatalhöyük, is very important for Jane Jacobs in her Economy of Cities, and she argued that actually here urbanity developed. So this is her origin of urbanity. And in fact, these settlements here are the first real settlements which we know beyond these temple structures which we have seen before. The absolutely crazy thing, by the way, regarding Göbekli Tepe, which I want to quickly tell you, is that these stories, of course, then traveled upwards all the way to Stonehenge and Ireland, where similar people, probably of a Middle Eastern origin, were talking stories, were buried in big burial mounds, and started similar types of ritual sites as we have seen in Göbekli Tepe. You have to imagine that the surface on the planet, even at that time, was already quite permeable. People were moving a lot and exchanging, and these ideas were spreading far north, also there generating early settlements and ritual sites with very similar ideas, concepts, and even narratives, and sometimes even family bonds between sites like that. But now back to Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük is an interesting site. It had a population of around 3,000 to 8,000 people, so it's like a small town. I'm left now in interactions. It had some degree of collective action in hunting, herding, and farming. They still were hunting and baiting wild animals, so animals were not quite domesticated yet. And somehow, in these couple of hundreds of years, an increased sense of self started to develop through spatial definition and organization. So people started to have houses for families and sometimes even rooms for individuals. And that started a kind of an individualization process and a kind of a mental mapping of your environment, which of course still is with us today. Çatalhöyük, however, was not only a farming village and a hunting village, but also involved in obsidian trade, in timber trade, shells and baskets. And already there, these trade routes were quite far-reaching, as you see here. They also did a local exchange of beads, clay, stones, and animals, and they developed the first pottery and storage bins for plant foods and obsidian. What we see in the archaeological record is a town with tightly packed buildings, no streets, and no buildings of special importance. It is as if this early town was still a prototype. Quote unquote, streets had not been invented yet. You know, the idea of public space had not been invented yet. The idea of a hierarchy of buildings also had not been invented yet. But it was an egalitarian agglomeration of individual houses into a first village structure. And this village structure basically was moved about via the roofs. So people entered their individual buildings through the roofs, and in today's Iran, some buildings like that you still find. Equally, probably, it must have been a fairly egalitarian society, perhaps a council of elders, maybe matrilinear, maybe patrilinear, we do not know that exactly. So also the society, that is argued, was as egalitarian as the town infrastructure they built. There is a strong symbolism visible, which has to do with hunter prowess and feasting. So you will see bull horns and things like that on the walls. And what is most important, you have a kind of objectification of the social process, or what Einhodder, which we will meet in a second, calls entanglement. What this means is that all of a sudden we have an archaeological record of social relationships, right? People don't just behave in the open, but their behavior becomes matter and therefore becomes visible in the archaeological record. So here you have these trade routes, again already reaching through the entirety of the Fertile Crescent, looking to find the things they needed from different sites. So already these are quite considerable distances. And remember that Mesopotamia at the right-hand side does not yet exist. These are still farming towns along these trade routes. Einhodder, an archaeologist from Cambridge, was very instrumental in the archaeological work on this site, and he wrote quite a beautiful book, The Leopard's Tale, Revealing the Mysteries of Çatalhöyük, where he describes a bit what happened. You see here this city system I described. Again, you see the sameness of the buildings coagulating together. You see the absence of streets. You see the absence of hierarchy. An early prototype of a city, not yet able, of course, to grow into bigger city systems. Uruk and Ur, you cannot organize like this because at some point it becomes unmanageable, right? There had to be more inventions in order to make bigger cities, not just this. This is what it probably looked like. Again, you see how people were entering their individual spaces from the roofs. You see animal husbandry and wheat being collected, baskets being made. This is an individual building of probably a small family. And you see here these bull horns in the middle. This is what these hunter prowess feasting rituals, which we mentioned before, referring to. There must have been stories which had to do with the power of animals. What is also interesting is that you see that the space is organized into a place for cooking, a place for sleeping, a place for storage, and then work on the roof. And this symbol in the middle, of course, a place for ritual of some sort. So you see that here society became spatialized, became complex. And you see here the entanglement, so the weaving together of biological species, wheat and animals, of technology, storage, drying, basket weaving, of narratives, symbolism, rituals, and of course, important for us as urbanists and architects, of spaces. You see here the spatialization of social structures. This knowledge then was taken down to the Mesopotamian area where the first big cities were developed, Uruk and Ur. So here you had already a much more differentiated society. So in the left, in the interactions, you see you have social differentiation with priests, officials, soldiers, merchants, teachers, laborers, farmers, craftsmen, and slaves. You had the very first form of writing, cuneiform writing. It was probably a patriarchal structure. These cities were already transacting quite a bit. There was sea trade, river trade, caravan trade in this polycentric urban system. Importantly also, these forms of writing allowed you to formalize trust in the terms of futures. So you had commodity-based money and commodity markets in form of writings on clay tokens to represent the amount. So for example, you could buy wheat futures. You know, I could do some work today. I get a tablet with some writing on it, which gives me the right to a certain amount of wheat a year from now. So the futures market developed, and you had the first weighing. The Ziggurat temple complex was the religious and administrative center of the city, so very much the legitimation core of the city. You had a polytheistic religion with anthropomorphic deities, walled cities, large-scale irrigation systems, and most importantly, the first codified law system. Now, important for you to understand is that this is a package of culture, and you need all the elements in order to generate that type of complexity which we see in this Mesopotamian city, right? So you need the ability to write in order to have a futures market. The future market helps you to have better agriculture. In order to control that, you need to have a good religious framework and you need a law, right? So here, the city became institutionalized. Çatalhöyük was a prototype, a testing around, messing around, trying different things. This is a codified city system which basically has all the elements which you see now in our city systems, just in a simple, still quite understandable format. Again, almost like in a caricature, you have the city with its walls, you have the canals bringing water from the Euphrat. Around these city walls, you have 4-kilometer ring of agriculture. You have a differentiated urban fabric with individual private houses and roads. You have hierarchy of spaces, small buildings, big buildings. You have symbolism. You have the ability really to be a city. And this is a technology, right? Cities are a cultural technology, almost like a spaceship, allowing us to exist together in a way with some degree of autonomy symbolized by these walls. And again, I told you last time already, when you were standing on this ziggurat on the top, then you see this quote from Austin Henry Layard, who was in northern Iraq in the 1700s. He writes, "From the walls I had an uninterrupted view over a vast plain stretching westward to the Euphrates and losing itself in the hazy distance. The ruins of ancient towns and villages rose on all sides, and as the sun went down, I counted above 100 mounds, throwing their dark and long thinning shadows across the plain. These were the remains of Assyrian civilization and prosperity." Assyrian being the civilization which came slightly after the Sumerians further north from Mesopotamia. You see here the cuneiform also in buildings. You see here again one of these. This is a contract, basically. It's a contract which is 5,000 years old and basically again distributes rations of beer. Also here, beer was important. Again, drinking beer, baking bread is as urban as building a building. Never forget that, because it helps you to deal with your clients very well. And again, this system already had very diverse trade routes. You know, next to Mesopotamia here, there was also the Harappa Valley here, which was starting almost at the same time, slightly after. And in this entire area, there were various trading connections and so on in the Bronze Age. Important maybe also to understand, bronze is of course a metal which needs two metals from which to make it. A Legierung in German. You need copper and you need tin. Copper came, for example, from Cyprus. Cyprus, basically, the name Cyprus comes from the Greek name of copper. And tin very much came from Afghanistan, so from the east. So these trade routes were also technologically very important, right? Because tin and copper, and in the end many other things, were very important. And tin and copper maybe had the importance of fossil fuel today. It was absolutely at the core of this civilization, and these resource flows had to be protected at all costs. So from the Sumerian, Assyrian, the Levante cities, so where today's Israel is, this idea of urbanity then spread also to, we have seen it earlier, to Cyprus as a place where resources were attracted, and also to Crete, where a new civilization and empire started to develop. A civilization which invented a new form of writing, so the so-called linear A. They had some form of oligarchy, because basically, I assume it started with wealthy farmers. They had sculpture, crafts, jewelry, theater, and in general, their art shows a peaceful, everyday life. And Crete was trading with Egypt, Asia Minor, Syria. It imported copper and ivory. It exported pottery, oil, wine, and timber. So again, a kind of a farming oligarchy which was exporting the goods their land could deliver. Also, they had a commodity-based exchange. On their island, they produced everything for the basic needs, but they imported a lot of luxury products. They did not have money, but used gold and silver probably simply as a commodity. And here these large farms turned into palaces which became the trade, administrative, religious, and possibly political centers. However, these palaces were not fortified, so it seems to have been a very peaceful civilization. There were 4 palaces, probably federally organized, and they had some form of matriarchal religion and were believing in goddesses. So this is Knossos, one of these 4 big palaces / farms. And what you see here is basically the storage rooms, because again, imagine this as gigantic farms which looked like palaces. And in these storage rooms, you had oil and wine and all sorts of things. And of course, in these storage rooms, probably also the myth of Theseus and Ariadne developed, where Theseus had to slay the Minotaur in the labyrinth, maybe trying to find his way through these dark caverns below the palaces of the Minoans. So this is what these Minoan storage rooms actually looked like. And this is this absolutely beautiful culture they developed. I saw these wall paintings myself, and they're absolutely stunning. It must have been, again, a kind of a Garden of Eden with a great culture living together in this fairly peaceful, federalized manner. But as we have seen last time, in order to trade, you need ships. In order to defend yourself, you need a navy. Ships, palaces, and agriculture requires the cutting of trees. Trees then, of course, become, on the one hand, a scant resource. You need more trees, and growing trees takes time. You cannot do this immediately, so you need to start importing timber. And at the same time, cutting down the tree cover also increases your ecological vulnerability. That both together then the vulnerability on the one hand and the requirement for trees, of course, required to start trading also with places way beyond Crete, for example, with Mycenae. And we can be quite sure that the contact between Mycenae and Knossos was quite important for Mycenae, because they again did some import replacement. For example, left top, they took the linear A writing of the Minoans and turned it into linear B, sort of a local variety, right? They also borrowed the idea of the oligarchy from the Minoans. However, and they also had a commodity-based exchange. However, they were more centralized, and they were probably more belligerent because they were linked to a hinterland which was much harder to defend than an island in the Mediterranean Sea. So you had a palace complex of the king surrounded by a fortified wall as a political and economic center, and very much an orientation towards the sea, where people traveled over the Mediterranean Sea to then make trading outposts and start new towns and so on, because the Greek landscape in the back behind them was quite mountainous. So again, after Crete, which was a non-walled society, we have here a walled society again. You might remember the stories of Agamemnon and so on. And the Bronze Age Crete again was with Mycenae here in the middle, again was a kind of a place where the first cities kind of developed around the trading area of the Mediterranean Sea, where a lot of goods were shuttled back and forth. We know that this happened because of, on the one hand, the fact that the chemical composition of blue glass beads in Egypt, in Mesopotamia and Mycenae was always the same. So it was the same glass which was traded. We do know, again, we heard it earlier, that tin and copper had to be brought together to generate bronze. Therefore, trade was inevitable. But many other things were also traded, and we know how many things were traded because of this ship, the ship of Uluburun. Uluburun, the Great Cape, I think it's Turkish, I'm not entirely sure, was shipwrecked, and in this shipwreck we find copper ingots. So we find raw copper, we find tin, we find pithoi, so large pots with dates, with wheat. We find blue glass ingots. We find perfumes, gold, stones, shells. Unbelievable wealth, all stored away in this little vessel traveling the Mediterranean Sea. So this was this Bronze Age culture which was stable for quite some time, probably 3 millennia about. And then, and of course Egypt was also part of this bronze culture, which we'll get to in a second. And then something happened around 11,000 before Christ. We see in a lot of different places stories of collapse, stories of invasion and battles. We see here, for example, in this fresco in the temple of Ramses III, one of the pharaohs of Egypt, the pharaoh who presided over the last big blossoming of the Egyptian culture. And we see here how Ramses III on top right is depicted to win against what was called the Sea People. So something in this time happened, and Eric Klein, again an archaeologist, wrote a great book about this, 1077 before Christ, the year civilization collapsed. On the top right again you see Ramses III fighting the Sea People. And the argument of Eric Klein is that there was probably not one reason why the Bronze Age societies collapsed, but there were many. Again, there were the Sea People, which is one theory, invaders from the Black Sea, traveling into the Mediterranean Sea and attacking towns along the coast. There were 8 earthquakes, there were volcano eruptions and big waves. You had the Libyans attacking Egypt. They did this several times, by the way. You had the Dorians invading the Mycenaean Greece, going all the way to Knossos. The Dorians, by the way, then later on founding cities like Athens and so on. So all of these states took a big hit. Egypt survived it, celebrated therefore in this fresco about Ramses III. The Assyrians and the Hittites and the Mycenaeans did not. They were then turned into archaeological sites afterwards. And the argument could be that several different problems conspired to bring this collapse about. So more than the coming of the Sea People in 1207 and 1177, more than the series of earthquakes that rocked Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean during a 50-year span, more than the drought and climate change that may have been ravaging these areas during this period, what we see are the results of a perfect storm that brought down the flourishing cultures and peoples of the Bronze Age, from the Mycenaeans and Minoans to the Hittites, Assyrians, Kassites, Cypriots, Mitannians, Canaanites, and even the Egyptians. In hindsight, of course, we would talk about a kind of a systemic vulnerability, or what C.S. Holling, our systems ecologist from the first lecture, has called brittleness. So the connectedness which grew and emerged over several hundred years, even millennia, during and bringing about the High Bronze Age, that connectedness started to unravel and became brittle. And all of these problems together, these individual civilizations could not survive with the exception of Egypt. However, another society kind of survived, which was the Phoenicians. They had their early cities in Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, and then they started to trade along the Mediterranean coast, importantly starting cities like Carthage, of course that then being the big opponent of Rome, which came later. And the Phoenicians, they were basically spreading again urbanity, now not only in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, where Bronze Age was destroyed and had to kind of recover, but very much now also in the Western Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenicians invented alphabetic writing. They had a coastal sea trade due to limited agricultural resources and abundance of timber for the construction of ships. So they avoided the lands, of course, because in the lands there were all the problems of this collapsing Bronze Age. They had a network of independent city-state ports and no overarching ideology or governmental structure allowing stability. So they had a kind of an agile, decentralized, very much sea-based way of spreading a city system at a time when more stable societies were collapsing. This is a quick glimpse of Egypt. Here, Memphis, the northern big city of Egypt, before then the center, specifically also the religious center, moved down to Thebes, further south or up river. Maybe also an effect of going away a bit more from the coasts. And this is, of course, an artist's impression from the computer game Assassin's Creed Origins, which is interesting that a lot of people are now interested in these lost cultures because, of course, there is an implicit and, in my case, also an explicit attempt to understand where we come from. Now, the Egyptian city is, of course, immensely fascinating. It is a cosmopolis, so they had a melting pot of Jews, Greeks, Egyptians, and Babylonians. They had a highly differentiated society with pharaohs, priests, soldiers, scribes, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and slaves. They invented the calendar, an early form of water clock, the decimal system, papyrus for writing, and so on. Importantly, the Egyptians were dependent on the River Nile bringing fertile new soil to their shores, flooding the fields, but also bringing fertility. So therefore, two key knowledge systems came out of that. The knowledge to predict the flood and to organize agricultural life according to the Nile and the seasons. That generated the interest in astronomy, in the calendar, and time in general. And then also, of course, the interest in measuring land and in fortifying land, improving stonemasonry, measurements, calculations, and planning to a degree that also if your fields are regularly flooded, you can still control and organize land ownerships. This control of measuring, planning, and stonemasonry, of course, allowed then the Egypts to generate an urban culture to the degree which we now know it from the archaeological records, with Memphis, temples like Luxor, the pyramids, and so on. The ancient Egyptians, they imported and exported goods. They had very specifically Alexandria designed as a trade hub between Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean world. Alexandria, which of course was founded at the very end of the Egyptian kingdoms, the three. Importantly, they had the pharaoh as a god on earth, so a very strong narrative allowing them to control this complex civilization and urban structure. And the ancient Egyptian religion was a complex system of polytheistic beliefs and rituals which were an integral part of ancient Egyptian society. Of course, as soon as you need so much technology, infrastructure, and narratives in order to keep your civilization intact, you need really strong stories to make people work in a common direction. A common direction may be big and strong enough that you can build something like the pyramids. We have to imagine that working on the pyramids were not only slaves, but also people doing a service towards their pharaoh and their religion. And each of these three kingdoms the Egyptian had was each time a reboot where a new narrative was founded. So a new religion or a new form of religion was developed, increasingly monotheistic, by the way, and a new central city developed, and a new civilization boomed up again until it collapsed again. So in Egypt we see this boom and bust with three kingdoms, so three booms and then the consecutive decay again, collapse again. And the River Nile, of course, is the biological system and the geographic system which drives this urban culture. The Nile is so fertile that whatever we humans do to it, it will still bring the ability to continue farming life and to restart the civilization. So here, a complete collapse didn't happen, a complete collapse, but rather a reboot, probably because the ecological system of the river is so incredibly strong and powerful. Similarly, by the way, in China, you also have a civilization which booms and collapses, not in terms of moving sideways, but in terms of staying in place and reinventing itself on the same location. Here we have Alexander the Great, a Greek person, more specifically Macedonian person, so from the north of the Greek area, invading Egypt, founding Alexandria, which then of course leads us soon to the Roman Empire. But before we do that, we quickly look at Athens. We have seen that the Dorians were kind of sacking Mycenae, were moving into the Greek peninsula and started their own cities. The cities like Athens, where we believe our earliest ideas of democracy happened. We have here the idea of the citizen, which became developed, which as an individual guarantees the stability of the community. These individuals together form democracy. We have the invention of money with the drachma. We have the standardization of measurements. We have a minimum amount of involvement of the state in trade, except for grain. So we have the differentiation between the state and the individual life, so the political life and the personal life. The idiotes basically is a private person, so the idiot is kind of a private person not being involved in politics. And we have city-states with no overarching ideology or governmental system, so they're really a loose federation of city-states, each of them working together, of course then producing absolutely marvels of architecture like the Acropolis. And of course still impressive today. But then in even further west, in the Italian peninsula, a new city kind of developed out of the former Etruscan world. Rome was being founded, and Rome of course then took all of that which has been developed in terms of urban knowledge, in terms of institutions and infrastructures, narratives and spaces, and rolled that out in an unbelievably successful but also unbelievably brutal empire-like manner. Rome, of course, was an ancient megacity of around 1 million inhabitants, so the biggest city ever on the planet. It was a cosmopolitan empire which exchanged knowledge over the entire Mediterranean Sea. It was very much organized in terms of social division, so people differentiated in a fairly brutal way. The difference basically, on the one hand, running in terms of Rome, but also running in itself, but also in terms of running vis-a-vis the colonies. And it was very much a slave-based economy, so human labor was driving this empire. Roman colonies had to support the consumer growth in the capital, so it was very much an extractive urban culture. In order to be effective enough in extraction, you had standardization policies, you had one system of measurements, you had a currency, and you had a colonial and new towns as urban system. Again, a kind of imperial colonial form of extracting goods, services, and products from their empire. That, of course, was run by military power. It was run by a very strong legal code, and it was run by an urban technology which was unprecedented. The Romans were unprecedented urbanists because urbanity for them was a form of projecting military power into the colonies to extract resources. And these cities were organized around this military grid of Cardo Decumanus and fed by infrastructure projects which were also unprecedented. And with this powerful urban system, they were basically able to integrate the mare internum, so the Mediterranean Sea, into one big system. Basically one big system primarily feeding Rome. And of course also this system developed. There were a lot of, it collapsed. There were a lot of reasons. The breadbasket of North Africa with all the agricultural land becoming less fertile. Probably the Sahara in part has to do with the ecological degradation the Romans brought about on Africa, northern Africa. You had the silting up of Ostia, so the harbor of Rome, so the ships couldn't land so easily anymore. You had narratives which changed. You had an overextendedness, again, brittleness, which finally led to the collapse of the Roman Empire. But still, we see this urban system in all of its splendor and magnitude in the archaeological record here. The Roman colony of Timgad in today's Algeria, very much again an outpost orchestrating the resource flow towards Rome. And here we see the extent to which these resource flows functioned and the trading routes which spanned, of course, the known world at the time, probably with an early form of the Silk Road going all the way to the Far East. When Rome collapsed, then Byzantium in the east, today's Constantinople or respectively Istanbul, still survived until around 1456, when it was run over by the Osmanians. But in this vacuum on the Italian peninsula, in this chaos generated by the collapse of Rome and the intrusion of the barbarians, so the Visigoths, for example, into that area, some of the people, probably even from Rome, retreated to the marshlands in the northern Adriatic Sea, kind of working there together with the fishermen probably already there, and protected by these marshlands on an island in the Adriatic Sea, they started a new settlement. Today's Venice. Venice, of course, due to the protection by the sea, was able to slowly stabilize, to grow, to become more adept again at being a city. It was a city again functioning as a melting pot with tolerance to other religions. It was very much a kind of a colonializing oligarchy. So it was very much organized around the interests of trade, first peaceful, then increasingly invading. It was a city-state system as the most reliable form of self-defense. It was built upon the Roman Empire infrastructure. It was ruled and financed by merchants and artisans, and already had a zoning into industrial districts. So for example, the ghetto was a place where metalworks were being produced. And this Venice then again changed, blossomed, grew over time, and again started to control large areas of the Mediterranean Sea, taking over the vacuum Rome left in its wake, and cooperating, but increasingly also competing with Constantinople. And of course, Venetia again had an immense hunger for goods, a hunger also specifically for timber, because all of Venice is built on wooden poles in the marshlands of the sea. These wooden poles first were local and later very much were Dalmatian forests which were cut down, shipped to Venice and rammed into the ground. But Venice also controlled other parts of the Mediterranean Sea, again in large parts also extractive. While Venice blossomed here, also other cities started again to function. Genoa, for example, or Naples. And the Genoese again had trade routes together with the Venetians. The Venetian here in blue, the Genovese in red, where they mix, you have them in violet, and started to trade over long distance. And again, this ability to be a city was then brought from Genoa to other places, slowly restarting the European continent, which was in shock still after the collapse of the Roman Empire, restarting it in terms of towns, trade routes, and increasingly urban knowledge. And also in the north with the Hanseatic cities, so Hamburg, Lübeck, Danzig, and so on. And in the Baltic Sea, you had another city system which kind of came in the vacuum left by the Romans. And we have to imagine that during this time, since it was very unsettled, a lot of people were fighting, a lot of battles were fought, and specifically along the fertile river basins of the Po River and the Rhine River here. And at the same time, these areas were also places where you could easily exchange, and both the potential for conflict and the possibility for exchange made it a good idea to start a market town. So a place protecting exchange again, like we have seen in our urban axioms, with a wall and a market with people in it free to do business. So what you see here is the amount of conflict cities have experienced in the Middle Ages. So the blacker they are, the more conflict. And you see that that coincides also with the amount of founding towns. And this basically led to this kind of urban systems spanning through Europe from the Po River Delta via the Alps down the Rhine to Netherlands and Belgium and today's England. And that then again, of course, became the economically most productive area of Europe today, the so-called Blue Banana. But the Genovians moving around Spain, along the coast, along the Atlantic coast, up to northern Germany, sort of coming from the north also to these trade routes going over land, then started again to generate cities. For example, a city like Bruges. And Bruges was the first good port for these Genovians and Venetians going north. Therefore became incredibly important, again, in a form of import replacement, with huge wealth, again, also tolerance. And it was a place where the Mediterranean traders met the Hanseatic traders from the north, linking these two systems, which led to a form of merchant capitalism with risk and profit sharing between merchants. It started with the establishment of economic colonies in England's wool-producing districts. And again, a city with marketplaces, commercial aspirations, walls and canals were being built, looking somewhat like this in this early map from 1635. Next to Bruges, the next city, so to speak, was then Amsterdam, which took what Bruges learned and made it even better. It was a society dominated by profit-searching merchants, a vast diversity of people, which led to innovation in trade, in science, in industry, with the pendulum clock, the telescope, and the microscope. It was a place away from the European wars between Spain specifically and other places. They invented resources for cheap energy, so wind-powered sawmills and so on, to better construct ships. And with all of that knowledge, were then able to really starting colonies. For example, modern New York, which first, of course, was New Amsterdam. And Amsterdam, because it was such an important trading port, was then given freedom from the Catholic control during the Great Revolt in 1572, and was then able to expand even more, looking somewhat like this. Imagine this as a kind of a machine, not only to transact and interact internally, but a machine very much to trade globally. This was a machine for global trade, and step by step, a machine for colonization. For example, with New Amsterdam or present-day New York. But Dutch traders went all the way even to Japan, here on the island of Deshima. Now, what Bruges started, what Amsterdam perfected, in London then reached its culmination. Remember that Bruges started trading with wool producers on the British Islands. So again, import replacement, making these places smarter and smarter. And London then really became the center of the world for a while. In London also, or next to London, Manchester and other places, industrialization developed. So the better organization of work with machinery in a way to save time of humans and animals. Machines before did exist. Already the Egyptians had steam power, already the Greek had steam power, but used it just for fun. The Romans had machinery for war and machinery for theater, but machines were not yet used for production. That started in England. And England had raw materials such as coal, iron, and tin, and was able to turn that into the first large industrial culture. And national trade was then very, very much concentrated in London. And a couple of other things happened which were interesting. For example, the church lands were sold after the English Reformation based on an edict by the king. And that then again liberated resources. The lands of farmers was consolidated, and economic institutions like the Bank of England, etc., had been created, and a large bureaucracy had been established in London. So the invention of the machine and the reduction of human labor allowed power. It incidentally also allowed to liberate the slaves. So England was very much interested in abolishing slavery because they had other sources of labor, i.e. machines. In the coffee houses of London, the first journals were being printed, giving information to these increasingly democratic individuals running this urban society. And with the ships and the money that they developed, this nation became then increasingly powerful, growing from a small city here, 1576 into the large city which we know today. A person who was, by the way, quite important in all of this was Isaac Newton, who is not only in some ways the inventor of modern science, or one of the co-inventors of modern science, hugely important for his laws of gravity and other things, but he was also a dabbling alchemist looking for the philosopher's stone, and later in his life became the master of the mint. So he was the person who perfected the English money system in a way with scientific tools to a degree that this currency was so perfect that everybody wanted to have investments in it. And that, together with the industrialization, with a bureaucratic state, the ability then to take the entire nation as a collateral to build powerful fleets, allowed then the English to win against the French, Louis XIV, the Sun King, and become basically the origin of modern capitalism as we know today, which of course was inherently linked to infrastructure, industrialization, capital, and very much also to colonialism. When we now look a bit more precisely how this industrialization developed, then we can look at Manchester, which grew very fast with a system, with an economic production that was also a social system, where textile industry became better and better organized, and where a small town, 1650, developed then these large cotton mills during industrialization. So originally, the English, which were already quite effective in terms of sharing resources and dividing work, they originally they originally were basically spinning their own wool and so on. That as a source of the entire textile industry, but then started importing cotton from one of their colonies, from India. And that cotton then was increasingly efficiently turned into textiles, to a degree that in the end England was exporting textile products back to India, basically taking away their economic base, simply because industry made them so much more effective in terms of labor. And all of this together allowed England then to become an empire organized around this central place, London, very much also feeding London and the cities around it, but of course dominating the planet to a very large degree with all of these colonies and members of the Commonwealth, which only got abolished, so to speak, during and in between the two world wars. Paris was a slightly other case. In Paris, the king did not make the same decisions as in England. So feudalism was still well entrenched and increasingly unfair. That led to civil unrest caused by high taxations and poor crop yields. At the same time, new narratives were being developed with the French Revolution, of course. You had the abolishment of the French monarchy with the French Revolution and the establishment of a secular democratic republic. You had the invention of the free individual, the abolishment of slavery in the French colonies, women's rights were recognized. And all of that then, however, was taken and somehow in parts undone, in some parts continued by Napoleon Bonaparte, who exported the ideals of the French Revolution almost worldwide. And, or let's say European-wide, because again, in Russia, he then was defeated. But since then, the idea of democracy built around free individuals was very much part of our Western societies. Here, the French Revolution, 89 to 1799, and the declarations of rights of man and of the citizens. And this generated so much pressure, this emancipation of individuals, that of course this pressure had to be taken somewhere. And colonization very much, of course, is also the ability of a culture organized around the emancipation of individuals to let off steam, so to speak. You know, on the one hand, you extract resources from the colonies, which you need to feed your industrial core. On the other hand, of course, you also give open spaces and possible biographies to your young people who are then willing to conquer the world with you. And Napoleon tried to do that in Egypt, finding things like the Rosetta Stone, being, however, ultimately vanquished by a combination of Osmanians and English counterforce. From these colonies, we have seen New Amsterdam, and from the English colonies, then the east coast of the United States, or North America at the time, was being populated. You had New York as a center of immigration, very much the trading hub between the two worlds, the Americas and the old world, Europe. New York, of course, dominated American shipping because they had this deep water port in the heart of the Hudson. They had a central position in the ocean, in the nation, direct access to the ocean, and industries congregating around the port. So New Amsterdam quickly developed into New York, slowly settling on the Manhattan Peninsula. Now, in the hinterland of New York, a second city then developed without direct access to the seas, but with an access to the hinterland, to the new frontier. And Chicago changed rapidly because it was basically a core of extraction from the new hinterland, feeding the increasingly hungry cities on the coast of North America. So it developed very quickly. It basically changed from this view in the 1820s, where Chicago was interesting because it allowed you to move from the Great Lakes, which were linked to the Atlantic, via a little bit of land, basically to the Mississippi River watershed, which linked you to the Mexican Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico, and was therefore used by the Native Americans quite a lot to trade. So that's why Chicago is incredibly well placed, because it links these two gigantic watersheds. And Chicago in the 1820s, so from this image, changed very rapidly, and only 50 years later looked like this. An amazing explosion of urbanity organized around settlements and urban growth, but of course very much also around resource extraction. So here a quote from an amazing book by William Cronon, Nature Metropolis, Chicago and the Great West. In their eyes, nature would combine with the progress of human population to call forth a metropolis to lead the Great West, Chicago. Triumphant cities of the past, stretching back to classical antiquity, had achieved lasting fame because their destiny had been an imperialist one. The ultimate crowning city, Chicago, would achieve comparable fame by making all of North America, indeed all of the world, its empire, right? So this is the ambition which Chicago had. And you see how this trade post became increasingly industrialized with huge grain silos and with the gigantic hinterland here with the Rock Island and Pacific Railroad system, which basically was organized to settle the new frontier and of course to extract resources from the Great West in the terms of farming land and living stock, which generated gigantic resource flows, of course. Here the stockyard and packing town in Chicago. So all of what you see on the right is beef, is cattle basically. Cattle you can transport easily when they're still alive, so that's why they had these huge stockyards and slaughterhouses, from where then it was then processed and shipped further to the coastal cities like New York. And here, Chicago in the 1900s, again, still only 180 years after it was Virgin territory. And then in the 1909, with the Plan of Chicago, the attempt then to organize it a bit better. So this is basically urban, so the extraction of resources from a hinterland by an urban core seen in an almost blatant clarity. And all of that together, specifically industrialization and everything these European cities had learned from the last millennia of urban history, from mathematics to the alphabet, to the Roman code of law, to merchant ways, to the banks, which were originally actually Genovian traders who in the 1300s set up their wooden banks, like literally bancas, to settle the trading debts over an entire summer. Like, this is the origin of banks. That then was taken by Bruges, Amsterdam, and perfected with the early capital markets. That then was taken by London and perfected by people like Isaac Newton. All of that together basically led to this Western domination for the next 200 years, colonizing all of the world. And in many ways, one nation, however, was resisting that, which was Japan, an island nation, which was highly organized. And during the Meiji period, Japan basically tried to, as rapidly as possible, again learn from these Western cities and become industrialized, militarized, and colonizing as quickly as they could. And they did this quite brutally. They forced industrialization internally, but closed their society to external influence with their sakoku policy. However, that sakoku was ended in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry of the US Navy basically went into the Bay of Edo, that time Tokyo, and started bombing the harbor of Yokohama, basically forcing the Japanese to open their trade ports. But still, the Japanese were clever enough to only slowly let the American in, learn as much as they could, and quickly start building railroads, improving roads, inaugurating a land reform program in order to prepare the country for further development. You see here Matthew Perry with his black ships moving into the Bay of Edo, which must have been completely shocking to the Japanese. Of course, the Japanese at that time were already in touch with Dutch traders, with Portuguese missionaries, so it was not completely new, but again, during their Sakoku time, they were able to shield themselves off these Western influences for quite a long time. But now they couldn't hesitate anymore. They knew they had to change rapidly because this industrial culture threatening to invade them was simply too powerful. So here we have very fast a change where they start building railway coaches, the first department store, and you see here how the development of Tokyo basically coincided with this killer application of the time, which was the railroad, where the department stores and the railroad companies started to cooperate in a way, and the railroad kings started to generate private lines with a department store in the core, an amusement park at the end of the line of this private railroad line, and settlements along the railroad line. And the development of Tokyo is very much a development along these private railroad lines linking up to a urban system which is organized very much by these dense cores. In some ways, the opposite happened on the other side of the globe with Los Angeles. Los Angeles, of course, the promised land for all of the people who didn't like the East Coast anymore, where the dream was sold by a new technology, movies, where then soon also de-industrialization happened, where the driver of urban growth was not anymore the railroad and the tram, but the car, which generated these gigantic metropolitan areas only with small moments of urban density. Urban density, by the way, which was still inherited from a moment when Los Angeles was actually in the beginning urbanized by tramways. But these tramways were then bought and demolished by people interested in oil and in cars, and therefore forcing the city into a completely new form of urban expansion. That's why you see Los Angeles still having some moments which has a tramway-based urban density, even so there are no trams anymore, but in the urban fabric you can still see this old part of Los Angeles, surrounded then by parts which has been settled completely by a car system. In the same time also the northeastern city of the US were increasingly growing together in a large stretch from Boston reaching all the way down to Washington, which was basically responsible for 20% of the US gross domestic product, mostly again organized around the automobile. That then led Jean Gottman in 1961 to first talk about the idea of a megalopolis, so a metropolitan region which is larger than an individual city, where everything is linked together into a gigantic region which is all connected in terms of resource flows and information flows. Again, on the other side, then something completely different happened around the university centers, Stanford and others, where then another technology has been invented, i.e. digitalization, because the West Coast was very much an ecosystem for innovation, and innovation very much driven by military interests. where digitalization had its roots in telegraph, radio, and military technology, but also became the hotbed for startups, for places like IBM, Xerox, and so on, where the government was also funding these developments, and was then, of course, part also in the invention of the internet, a DARPA-driven, so with military money-driven invention, then rolled out in Xerox PARC and others, which then led in a sequence of steps to these very large corporations, Google and Yahoo, which started to take over the world. And of course, a world which is very much organized around digital flows, around the car, around the connectedness, therefore, which is not so much urban, but polycentric and decentralized, and projecting now this image of an urban future onto the globe. So we have, on the one hand, these large urban regions, which of course, next to the Boswash, also exist in other parts of the world where cities are growing together, usually organized around one or two core cities. And these gigantic urban regions become increasingly powerful and are today, have always been, but are today again, the kind of the cores of economic production. So again, kind of following Jane Jacobs, the economy of cities, but now in a much larger scale. On this graph, you still have New York, Newark, and Jersey City as the largest economic center in the world. But we all know that China is catching up very quickly. And if this chart were more fair, then Beijing and Tianjin would be combined, of course, easily surpassing the US metropolitan regions. And Guangzhou, Guangdong, and Shenzhen would be combined. So the two largest metro regions in the world, megalopolis in the world, easily would be located in China. Simultaneously, you have the growth of middle-scale cities, which try to position themselves in different ways as alternatives. Here, the 600 fastest-growing cities, according to McKinsey, which are also very powerful and maybe an economic course of the future. And this is the state we are at right now. So basically, we started at this temple in Göbekli Tepe. We saw how this ability to be urban was perfected by the Mesopotamians, and then step by step increased with more tools, with more knowledge, with better infrastructures, and increasingly sound institutions, which give us this highly connected, globalized, planetary urbanization which we have today. And I want to leave you with this image. This is basically an illustration showing, as a short video, the migration of people, or of talent, as we would say today, from their birthplace in blue to their deathbed in red. And we see how cities throughout the centuries have been attractions for these talented people. These are the 150,000 famous people and their biographies mapped out in space. We see here Rome glowing, of course, for a very, very long time. We now see the Renaissance cities. We see London, we see Paris. We see this polycentric Alemannic system in Germany. We see Holland with Amsterdam and the Randstad. We see Madrid in Spain, and now the explosion, of course, happening in Europe. We see here the settlers arriving from Europe to the new continent, populating the East Coast, Mexico City below, you see how these people start the new frontier and start moving over to the West Coast. And this is maybe the best image to leave you with, in a way, showing you how the city system is both a promise and a danger. It is a hotbed of innovation, but also a generator of instability. And in many ways, therefore, what we inherited from our ancestors from 10,000 years ago in terms of knowledge. And this knowledge we now need to apply to understand the system which we have now seen in a way that we can bring it towards the next step, being aware of the benefits, but also aware of the instabilities which we have inherited. Questions? And again, in the next lecture, I will give you the horizontal section, so to speak. This was now a section vertically through time. Next time we will look at horizontally through space and networks. And the fourth lecture will be what this all has to do with us, our brains, the ability to speak and share information, and the ability to remember the past and project the future. And in many ways, therefore, the ability also to be architects. So this will be exciting, I hope.
Yes, thank you so much, Markus, for this fantastic journey to the origins. So that's amazing how you compressed the whole history of, let's say, of mankind also into this 1 hour and a half. So does anyone has any ideas or comments or questions?
One more question. In previous lecture, you said that in 2050, some kind of collapse is going to happen. And why in 2050? Why not in, I don't know, 2019? And why this collapse wasn't happened, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years ago?
Oh, it's a very good question. Again, I don't want to shock you with this vision of collapse. I think my argument in many ways is collapses are inevitable because we are looking at a dynamic system. Any dynamic system has a beginning and an end and a transformation. It's inevitable because we cannot keep growing the way we grow now. It's simply mathematically impossible. This number 2050 has been calculated by a professor at the ETH with the name of Didier Sornet. And he is originally a geophysicist, so he was finding formulas for calculating earthquakes. And in earthquake, what basically happens is that you have two tectonic plates next to each other, and they start to grind into each other, and you have then very small cracks. But the point is that small cracks generate instability, which leads to bigger cracks. That generates more instability, which leads to even bigger cracks. And at some point, this ramps up in a form of proportional growth. So the bigger the problem, the even bigger the consequences. Therefore, the even bigger the problem, etc. You know, so it kind of ramps up. And this this is just a formula, right? A so-called super exponential formula. So a mathematical formula where the y-axis grows faster than in an exponential formula. And these formulas he then applied to the cracking of airplane wings, to the to problems in automobile motors, and so on. And he also started then to apply the same formula to financial bubbles. And the insight here is that connectedness which generates surplus on many levels. So when things link together and therefore you have surplus on many levels, generate more power that allows you to generate more connectedness, that inherently gives you a super exponential formula. And so, for example, in a financial market, when you have a certain stock basically grow, for example, in the new economy, you had internet companies which became more valuable. Then people see that and say, I also want to invest in internet companies. That makes the stock more in demand. Prices rise, and then even more people are looking at it and saying, wow, I want to get rich too. And that means even more people are interested. So in the end, you have completely normal people who invest large amounts in the stock market. And that basically, this kind of feedback loops, that they generate a proportional growth. Proportional growth is super exponential, and a super exponential equation has a singularity in finite time. So it becomes vertical in finite time. That's inherent in the mathematics. You had the same effect in this Euler's coin, which I showed you last time, right? Where the coin was first spinning normally. Without gravity, the coin would spin forever. Without gravity and air, the coin would spin forever. But both gravity, the friction generated by gravity, and the air friction generated by the atmosphere slows the coin down, then it starts to tumble. As soon as it tumbles, it has more friction, etc., etc., etc. That generates a super exponential curve, which generates the stop of the coin at the very end. Now, this is mathematics. He did nothing else than apply the mathematics which he perfected in financial bubble research to this bubble we are in right now, the economic market since the birth of Christ, and the population since the birth of Christ. And when he applies this formula, he sees a singularity in 2050. The same problem we see when we look at, with the other graphic I have shown you, when you look at the amount of the planet which is occupied by humankind in this graph by Banowski, which then he sees a problem in 2045. So this simply means, in a very rational, objective way, it means we have an instability ahead of us. Right? And what I tried to show you, that instabilities like that also happened in the past. For example, in the Bronze Age, it was also a moment of instability. You know, when a system of cultures was perfectly trading, perfectly functioning in many ways, importing tin from Afghanistan, importing and trading copper from Cyprus and other places. We must understand this as an incredibly prosperous, probably very wonderful moment in time. But it ended, and what Klein tells us, this archaeologist whose book I showed, is that this ending was not one cause. It was not only the sea people, which we see in the writings, for example, in the temple of Ramses III. And it was not only an earthquake which was assumed to have destroyed the Minoan culture. It was not only ecological degradation of Mesopotamia, where all of a sudden the land became more arid and hard to produce agriculture in, but it was the combination of everything. And because there were so many, connectedness and trade is great. It's amazing, we love it. At the same time, it generates dependencies. What happens when the trade doesn't function anymore? What happens when the flow of tin and copper in the Bronze Age, or the flow of oil in our age, what happens when that stops? So it's a dependency. That dependency generates a vulnerability, or as C.S. Holling has called it, brittleness in the system, and then you cannot react anymore. So what we need to do, and that's the narrative I want to leave you with at the very end of these 7 lectures, we need to think in smaller circles, in smaller units, and we need to find partial autonomies in order to deal with the instabilities which we probably have ahead of us. So don't imagine the collapse necessarily as something dramatic, like a meteor striking Earth and everything being gone immediately. Imagine it as increasing amounts of pressures, from climate change to a pandemic, to economic pressures, to migration, to populism, which is basically doubting connectedness, for better or worse, right? Doubting exchange and doubting a liberal society, which of course, as we have seen with the French Revolution, a liberal society needs a place to go, right? And now we occupied everything except Mars and the Moon, so we maybe need to rethink our society in good ways. And this is totally not easy, right? This is not, and I do not have the solution. Of course I don't have the solution. What I want to generate in your heads and in your professional lives is a certain awareness of these issues, so that you are prevented from believing all of this superficial bullshit about sustainability, resilience, etc., in too easy a format, right? Sustainability and resilience are absolutely crucial and essential, but about 90% of what's being told underneath these keywords simply doesn't function. And there I want to make you fit to argue for yourselves in the future.
Can I have a question too?
Mm-hmm.
As I understood from your lecture, then cities, through their history, they go through times with collapses, and then they changed and transformed their urban shapes. And what do you think about today's situation? Are we already in this collapse period, and do we have tools to change our cities, to make them able to protect people from this pandemic situation, or do architects need to invent some new tools and trying to imagine cities in our way?
I mean, the answer is yes, I do believe that. This will be very much the content of my last 3 lectures. So in terms of, okay, so now we understand all of these things, what do we do now, in fact? But I do not have all the answers, and I also doubt some of my own answers in some ways, right? Maybe some of the ideas I have are actually wrong, and maybe some of you have better ideas on what to do. The biggest answer I already gave you with the work of C.S. Holling from last time, so the systems ecologist. You always have to assume that cities are a very special form of nature. So the division of thinking between nature and culture, or the countryside and cities, that thinking is wrong. We are all part of the same system. And we behave as a species simply in particular ways to avoid short-term collapses and short-term transformations with infrastructures and institutions. That then, however, of course, pushes risk into the future and forces us to move sideways into new territories, so to speak. Now, so basically, nature and culture are one thing. It's just that the connectedness of nature catches up with us in delayed ways. And in order to therefore act in it, we need to always enable the local. We need to be able to think in local autonomies, or what I called last time in subsidiarity. So subsidiarity is a very important term. Subsidiarity means you solve all of the problems you can on a local scale, and you have all the pleasures and stories and interactions you need to have a fulfilled life, to live a fulfilled life as local as possible, and you integrate and connect to a larger scale only where really possible, only where really necessary. This is subsidiarity, and then with this thinking you generate a nested system of local places, each one enabled, each one with their own autonomies, each one with their own abilities, and with that you in my mind you will have more stability. Now the problem is in Switzerland, for example, we have inherently a fairly subsidiary system because we have a very polycentric urban culture. So Switzerland is on the surface not a very urbanized culture because we don't have big cities. However, we have a lot of urban flows in this polycentric urban network. This idea of subsidiarity is of course much more difficult in larger cities, London or also Moscow, or the Chinese cities, because there it's harder to react. So I think this will be a gigantic problem on how to deal with big cities. But maybe also there, with ideas of urban farming, of including inhabitants in a good way, also in terms of governance, with local industry, etc., etc., etc. I think with that, this is one part of the solution. However, we cannot give up information flows and cultural flows also on the large scale. So this mix of the local and the global balance that in a new way, I think this will be the answer which we have to be looking for. And I can then show you a bit how we do that in a more practical way. And again, I really do not have all the answers. I want to very much enable you with a clear mental map in your head to look for the answers which you deem good and correct.
Thank you for answer.
Good, pleasure. Again, next time, don't forget, it's 1 hour later. I think Katja will send this link out with a new time and with a new time. Next time we will talk about networks and territories. And I hope you will enjoy it too.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Cool. All the best.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.
Ciao.